Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, welcome back to this flip that's, of course, going to be all about the Black Death, right? So, all right, I got to take this thing off, though. But again, Mary Dufresne, thank you for letting me borrow that and stuff like that. But we will get into this bad boy, right? We will actually talk about, like, plague doctor masks and outfits and stuff like that. In this flip, we will be discussing a lot of things. And apparently, this is one of her little friends that is, like, a little stuffed one. So she'll be hanging out with me during this flip and stuff like that, making her a little drop in. Again, Mary Dufresne, appreciate you. Now, look, getting into it, though. We left off in class talking about a lot of different stuff. And this is something that some of y'all have definitely actually seen before when it actually relates to the Black Death. And we'll discuss that, talk about like some of the bigger like kind of pop culture things that have popped up since the spreading of the plague. But when we're really talking about the plague, we do have to kind of stay delving into what the plague was, where did it come from, right? So most of us, we left off in class talking about how the plague probably started in somewhere we believe in Southeast Asia during this moment, right? We don't have any, right, we're not positive as to where the plague started out originally. We don't necessarily have any idea where it came from at first, but we do know that this instance of Yersinia pestis, that bacteria that causes the Black Death, did start probably around somewhere in Southeast Asia during this time period. So we know that it reaches Europe around 1347 via merchant ships on the island of Sicily. Now, interesting little tidbit about this and how it actually spread is this is Sicily right here, and this is where we believe that the plague landed. Now, there was a city in the Black Sea over here known as Kaffa, right? Kaffa was spelled K-A-F-A, and that we believe is actually the original city that is going to get the plague at one point, ended up spreading it to the rest of Europe. Reason being is that these people called the Mongolians were expanding throughout the Middle Ages in this general area of Russia and expanding all the way through this area. And in this instance, we believe that Kaffa was located right there, and we think it was attacked by a Mongolian army, and that Mongolian army specialized in doing one thing: throwing dead bodies of horses, animals, and people into these other cities to try and intentionally spread disease. So we believe the Mongolians might have actually thrown some plague bodies inside this like actual village known as Kaffa, and then somebody must have hopped on one of those merchant ships and then sailed to Sicily, where it then makes landfall in Europe. That's what you call your patient zero, right? So what ends up happening, though, is it spreads from the island of Sicily via merchant ships. It starts bopping around the entirety of Europe, and we do believe that merchants and traders are the most responsible occupation of people that are going to spread this disease. Because remember it like this, right? Merchants and traders have boats. Those boats are now moving all over Europe. All of those boats pretty much have rats on them. Those rats have this insect known as fleas that are going to be the thing that spreads the plague, right? Because something that you need to understand is there's actually 3 different types of the plague, right? So everybody always like, oh, the Black Death, oh, it's bad. Yeah, it is bad. But here's the thing. It does have several different variations of what it's called, what it causes it, and how it kind of moves through all of these different victims, right? So first one that you know of most colloquially speaking when you've talked about these things in class before is known as the Bubonic Plague, right? So the Bubonic Plague is the way you get it. So these all have to do with the epidemiology understanding of transacting the plague, how you got that Yersinia pestis bacteria into your body. Now, the first one, bubonic plague, you got that from infected fleas. And what would end up happening is actually apparently an infected flea would bite you, or not bite you, but an infected flea would consume bacteria from a rat, right? So, and these rats are carriers of this plague, they just don't die from it nearly as often. So they would consume the bacteria from the rat, and then inside the throat of the flea, the bacteria would begin to expand and multiply. This would create a blockage or a clot inside the flea's throat, and to get rid of that blockage, the flea would bite you and just go, and then like throw up into your body, regurgitating or vomiting plague bacteria, not plague virus, but plague bacteria into your body. Now, you could get it from a rat, but it was not nearly as common. You could get it from like scratches from rats or handling dead animals with the plague, but that's how you got the bubonic plague, is mainly from that flea and like throwing up inside your body. Now, you also could get the pneumonic plague, because what ends up happening is a major symptom of the plague was that the inside of your body would begin to bleed as blood vessels began to rupture, right? And so sometimes that blood would come out your eyes or your ears. We'll talk about the symptoms of this in a second. But in the long run of it, a lot of it would go into your lungs, right? And when you would cough the pneumonic or cough the plague out, those little droplets containing plague bacteria would be expelled out into the air. Someone inhales that, that's how they get the pneumonic form of the plague. And then you have the last form of the plague, the septicemic form of the plague. Septicemic form of the plague is when the plague is advanced so drastically, depending on how you got it from these two. The septicemic plague means basically you are going to die. And it's a 100% guarantee, because it means that your body has different things that are expanding throughout as actually necrotic flesh that's expanding and it's creating holes inside of your body. And so to give you an understanding of the plague itself and why this entire movement in history got so bad, you have to understand in general that basically when you're looking at a slow motion sneeze of someone, this is to show you how much stuff comes out your face, right? So it also shows you why we wore masks for such a long time. Oh my God, this is just a regular normal sneeze, and apparently those droplets come out at over 60 miles an hour. I highly recommend that, just go up to your mom and show her this real quick. Be like, look what we're learning about in class. Look how gross it is. That stuff is what comes out of your mouth when you sneeze or cough. And so during the plague period in Europe, any one of those droplets, if they contained Yersinia pestis bacteria and you inhale that, then now we're dealing with an issue of infection, and now you have what is known as the pneumonic form of the plague. Super gross. Cover your mouth. It's really nasty. Now, other symptoms of the plague, of course, include the things that give it its name, right? So when you're looking at this whole thing, symptoms of the plague include one of these things known as a bulbous, right? So sometimes you would have lymph nodes that would get infected, and they would retain fluid, and they would swell to be about the size of a golf ball. So a common way to try and get rid of these things was known as lancing your bulbus, and that was really gross, and basically like pus and fluid would come flying out. Now, this is how you know you had the septicemic form of the plague. It's called lenticulation, right? Lenticulation is where the Black Death gets its name from, because it's when black necrotic flesh actually starts popping up in different areas of the body. That right there is somebody who has the septicemic plague or septicemic form of the plague, and that is their fingertips that are going necrotic. But you also could get black spots all over you, like known as lenticulation, and that's why they called it the Black Death, because of those spots actually popping up on you. Other symptoms, of course, include things like, for example, the big one is bleeding of the orifices, right? Pneumonia was a big one as well, and eventually, a person would probably succumb to all these symptoms and end up dying, right? So popular medical cures are then going to run rampant, which is where we get, of course, our plague doctor masks and things like that from, right? So the thing about it is, during this time period, because it's the Middle Ages, a lot of things are going to start popping up, right? So you're going to see doctors start to wear strange costumes. And this right here is actually the print from the 1300s demonstrating what a plague doctor may or may not have looked like. Now, interesting little fact about plague doctors in general. Yes, they did wear these masks and stuff like that, and apparently spices would be shoved into the end of them so they wouldn't have to smell dead or rotting corpses. They were given a staff to poke or prod someone with them so they didn't touch the person who had the plague. But we only have a couple of evidences of this ever happening. We only have a few prints, and if it's not widely talked about, it means it probably only happened pretty rarely. But still, the fact that these prints did exist during this time period does indicate to us that people are going to wear these crazy costumes and things like that. People also believed during the Middle Ages that if you bathed in human urine, it would help prevent the plague. Not true. It actually made it much worse, right? Wearing excrement, which is poop, was a believed way to also get rid of the plague. That didn't work either. Placing dead animals in your house made it worse. Definitely gave you the plague, right? Wearing leeches, not a good idea, but this all relates to bloodletting, which was a very big thing. Put that next to it. Wearing leeches / bloodletting was when they would also drain blood out of your body. But if bloodletting or wearing leeches and you're pulling some of that bacteria out of your body and then passing it on to somebody else, that's actually a way to give the plague to more people. Drinking molten gold and powdered emeralds and also burning incense to get rid of the smell of dead were popular medical cures. But notice really quickly, I have the word cures in quotation marks, which is indicating to us or telling us that these things didn't actually work, right? They actually made the spread of the plague much worse. And how, really quickly, do these things right here in general kind of show us the whole idea or vibe of the Middle Ages? That is exactly right, Remy Marshall. Fantastic answer. That is 100% right. Because during the Middle Ages, they weren't as intelligent, right? We didn't see literacy rates nearly as high. Literacy rates were only at about 4% during the high and late Middle Ages, right, of the entire reading population of Europe. And so this shows us or demonstrates that when this occurred, people kind of resort to old customs and trying to figure this out. But since the collective intelligence of the area wasn't high enough to figure out, of course, quarantining or keeping things away or washing your hands and stuff like that we know now with medical science, that's why it was so much worse and why these cures kind of kept popping up, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is if you're going to discuss how the plague was fought off in these weird, goofy ways, Big thing you need to understand, though, too, is by about 1353, how did the plague start to finally come to an end, right? Because, of course, if it didn't come to an end and killed everybody, none of us would be here right now. Now, it did kill 50% of Europe, which is absolutely crazy. Now, one of the biggest ones is the creation of quarantining, right? So quarantining actually came around, or the practice of quarantining came around during the plague period, right? So from around like 1350 or 1351, you started seeing the first instances of quarantining somebody. And where that word comes from is quarin, which is actually the subword root of most Romance languages, but particularly in Italian. Quarin actually means 40, as in quarento, right? So like quarin, meaning 40, quarantines originally lasted for 40 days, right? So every time a boat would come into the ports of these Italian cities after the plague started being spread, and they realized that these traders were probably the ones passing it around, they start making them isolate themselves for 40 days before they can actually exit the boat to make sure that they didn't have plague and that they weren't going to spread it to anybody else, right? That's a big one. Now, the other big one, though, is moving. Remember, we talked about how overcrowding led to the Black Death plague. People are going to start moving out of cities into countryside areas and isolating themselves away from people, and that's going to help us understand for a short time of actually stopping the spread of the plague in these super crowded cities. And also, the other thing, too, this isn't the first time the plague has happened. Plague popped up several different times throughout European history. One of the biggest ones actually was in 1666. In 1666, the plague popped up so bad that Isaac Newton actually moved out of out of London and went to a family estate out in a rural area, and it was there that he actually saw at an apple orchard an apple fall from a tree. He actually kind of creates the theory of gravity there, right? So this is not something that's not normal. Moving from a city into a rural area is a way that the plague actually finally came to an end. Hygiene, also a big one. Washing your hands, preventing the spread of bacteria, killing the bacteria in warm or hot water, right? That's huge. Cleaner air was a big one as well. This one is crazy. Apparently, they realized that having a fire in your home or having a very heated home or an open fire would actually kill some of the plague bacteria that's floating around through the air. Apparently, they figured this out because one of the popes, when he was anointing the sick, would sit between two large fires, and he never got the plague while he was anointing the sick. And so some people believe that this immense amount of heat or having a fire in your home or kind of purifying the air is going to be a way to help prevent the spread of the pneumonic form of the plague. Because we can't forget that. We got three types of plagues: bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and the septicemic form of the plague, right? So that's a big one. Travel and migration is also going to slow down for a period of time, giving people a chance to kind of reassess, and trade kind of comes to a little bit of a halt, and also periods without war. Because remember, the 100 Years' War actually had multiple periods of peace throughout it. This is one of the reasons why, right? During the 100 Years' War, when France and England were fighting each other, of course, Burgundy and Scotland also being involved, they actually had a period of peace during the plague time period, and that kept actually helped prevent the plague from spreading yet again, right? So that's a big reason why it ended. Now, there's also going to be massive effects of the Black Death plague throughout all of Europe, right? One big one, you're going to have a massive upsurge of faith and religion, right? So you're going to see the growth of faith during this time period. People are actually going to lean into Christianity more and believe that God was punishing them, so they needed to be more devout or more intense, right? There's going to be an economic effect of the plague that we're going to talk about here as well, which is actually, surprisingly enough, not what you think it was. The culture is going to be heavily influenced, especially in the field of art. Population is going to decrease. Of course, we're going to talk about that. And then also there's going to be a rise in anti-Semitism. And we're going to discuss that as well. Now, here's a big thing, for example, talking about the upsurge in faith and religion, right? So you started seeing people becoming more devoted to Christianity because of the Black Death, believing that if they prayed harder, went to church more, or expanded their understanding of God, that they would be able to avoid it, right? One of the biggest examples we saw of this in the plague time period were these people called flagellentes or flagellants, who would apparently roam around different parts of Europe, and they would beat themselves or hit themselves as a form of self-inflicted penance for their sins, right? This right here is a very, very famous scene that I highly suggest you show to one of your dads, your moms, if they've ever seen this movie before, that actually kind of relates to the flagellants. Yeah, so that right there is from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, very old movie from the 1960s, talks about like the Middle Ages and stuff like that. But those are flagellants, the guys hitting themselves in the face with the boards. So you saw a kind of an upsurge in faith and understanding of religion during this time period. You're also going to see, like I said, culture. Art is going to be heavily affected. You're going to see the growth of the imagery of death in art. What little art was produced in the Middle Ages anyway, but you started seeing a lot of different like pieces of art incorporating death or dead people or skeletons and things like that. For example, this one right here is a woodcut from the Middle Ages known as the Dance Macabre, which actually shows a bunch of dead people and skeletons dancing around during the plague time period because death was so prevalent and so many people were dying from the sickness. So medical technology is going to be expanded. I'll show you that video actually when we get a little bit later. This is another big one as well. Lancing a bulbous, which became very, very popular. That's a piece of art as well, showing people how to improperly open up one of those big swollen lymph nodes and drain the fluid out of it during the plague period. Now this one's a huge one as well. The economy, okay? So we just talked about a lot of different effects, right? We talked about how increase in Christianity is going to occur. We talked about how art's going to become obsessed with death. We talked about how travel and stuff, or like we're going to talk about like a couple of things as well. But the other big one that is very, very important is, of course, the spread or the economic effects of the plague, right? So the economic effects of the plague are going to be very, very intense. Those being, for example, the fact that during the plague, there was high amounts of unemployment, right? So while the plague was happening, you've got economic stagnation and unemployment. People are losing their jobs, they can't report back to work, they can't make any money. So you saw a high amount of unemployment or a bad economy during the plague. But after the plague, you saw less people. And less people means more specialty crops, more specialized jobs. And that means that more money is going to go into the hands of those fewer individuals. The way to look at it like this is like during the plague, let's say hypothetically we've got a class, right? We're going to use my C period really quick, right? If I'm looking at my C period, in my C period I've got several kids that sit near each other, right? I got Sophia Bacola, Morgan Bradbury, Mass Chaplin, Abigail Furtado, and let's just use those four, right? So we got those four kids that sit together, okay? Now let's say during the plague period though, Abigail Furtado dies, Madison dies, and then I don't know, Morgan Bradbury almost dies but gives up, loses her job, right? So who's the only one left right now that did that job? Sophia. That means if you want your shoes to be made, or if you want her to forge metal for you, you have to go see Sophia because she's one of the only people left alive that does this work, which means you have to pay her more money, right? So because she can charge more because she knows that there's not as much competition, right? So that's huge. So you're going to see the economy of the Middle Ages actually increase after the plague actually finally ends. So that's a huge thing, and you're also going to see a massive population decrease. Throughout the Middle Ages, you saw a very booming amount of population during the High Middle Ages, but then when we hit the Late Middle Ages during a time of war, famine, and disease, you saw population go down heavily, right? So we saw 25 to 35 million people in Europe die, which is close to 50% of the population of Europe. And then total population of the world, we believe, was about 443 million at the time during the plague. So 22% of that population died, which is about 100 million people worldwide, we believe, died from the plague. So you saw a massive population decrease, right? We can actually see that in a lot of different graphs that we use in academia. So population before and after plague. And you can actually see the really, really intense graphs and stuff like that that show you right here the massive dip in population right here due to the plague time period, right? Because this is when it hit Europe and population just went and came down and then progressively would climb up a little bit later on. Now this right here is a different kind of thing that happened. We'll talk about that a little bit later on when we get to the 1650s and stuff. But as you can see, population actually went heavily down during the plague time period in Europe, all right, or during the era of the Black Death, okay? And so last but not least, you're also going to see a dramatic uptick in this thing known as anti-Semitism, right? So anti-Semitism is when many individuals from the Middle Ages are going to start blaming a very specific religion for spreading this plague, and it actually is not true whatsoever, right? So during the Black Death period, the Black Death began as a dramatic persecution of Jewish people in Europe, right? A lot of Jewish people got blamed for spreading the plague because the plague wasn't as prevalent in their communities. Reason being is because most of the Europeans segregated Jewish communities away from them and made them live in isolated neighborhoods away. So basically, in a nutshell, before the plague ever even started, like, Jewish people weren't allowed to live around everybody else, so of course they're not going to get the plague because you isolated them away, right? You quarantined them for them, okay? And so they were blamed for spreading the plague because they apparently believed that people were putting it in wells and spreading it deliberately, which is stupid. So, like, that's a big thing as well, though, that you need to know. And that's where we're going to end, right? And so that is the Black Death in Europe. We'll wrap that whole thing up. We'll go over all that stuff tomorrow in class. I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.